Good evening. You're watching World News Tonight here on TVP World. I'm Anna Kalczyńska. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has rejected a 3-day ceasefire called by Russia's Vladimir Putin to start during Moscow's celebration of the end of World War II. Zelenskyy insists on a 30-day truce in line with the strategy proposed by the US. More on that in just a moment, but first, the latest headlines. The US State Department spokeswoman withdrew the US from mediation between Russia and Ukraine. Then she reversed that withdrawal and accused the media of spreading fake news. Romania's presidential election will be repeated on Sunday, with the leader of a radical right-wing party almost certain to advance to the second round. 234 years ago, Europe's first constitution was proclaimed in Warsaw, the second such document after the US. Ukraine rejects Vladimir Putin's proposal and insists on an immediate and unconditional ceasefire for at least 30 days. The Russian president has said he agrees in principle, but there are many issues that need to be clarified before that can happen, quote unquote. So let's go live to our Kyiv correspondent, Oz Katerji. Good morning. Oz, we understand Volodymyr Zelenskyy remains skeptical about Russia honoring any ceasefire. So tell us, what's the state of play then?
Well, that remains the case. Also, this is classic Kremlin line of, oh, we agree to do this proposal. We just have a few fine points that we need to discuss. And those points, when it comes to Ukraine, are always the total unconditional surrender of the Ukrainian armed forces, the ceding of territory to Russia, the demilitarization of Ukraine, and basically regime change. So these are the finer points that Putin talks about when he says that he wants to have discussions about these particular points. Now, President Zelenskyy gave a talk to journalists, a closed-door talk in which he discussed several positions. The first being that rejection, reiterating the rejection of this 3-day ceasefire, which Ukraine sees as a cynical PR move by the Russian president. Instead, they're pushing for this 30-day unconditional truce, which has been trying to be mediated by the United States, but they are having very little luck in that. Now, when it comes to the Ukrainian relationship with the United States, President Zelenskyy spoke about his meeting in the Vatican with Donald Trump, said it was the best meeting that he'd had with Donald Trump so far. He stressed the need for further air defense measures, also stressed that there were more sanctions that the US could implement on Russia. There was a change in tone from Trump following that meeting, so the Ukrainians still think that it went very constructively. The further point that he made was that the US mineral deal that they've signed with Washington will advance and enhance cooperation between the two countries, both economically and militarily. So those are the main points that Zelenskyy hit on in these discussions with journalists. He also made the point that the Moscow Victory Day, the day that Putin wants the ceasefire for, he refused to tell world leaders that they would be safe in Moscow on that day, and said, we cannot be responsible for what happens on the territory of the Russian Federation. So it should make Kyiv's position on this temporary ceasefire proposed by Putin very clear.
Oz, and the second case, because for the first time, a Ukrainian naval drone destroyed a Russian Su-30 fighter. Worth mentioning, he cost about $50 million. So what more do we know about this action?
It goes beyond that. This is probably the first time a combat aircraft has been downed by a naval drone in human history. So a remarkable piece of footage that was been released by Ukraine's intelligence services, showing this naval drone, which was piloted in the Black Sea region. And this fighter bomber, this Su-30 Russian naval fighter bomber, was quite close to the Crimean Peninsula and the Russian mainland when this attack took place. So this is quite an escalation in Ukraine's capabilities using unmanned surface vessels, otherwise known as naval drones. This does threaten more Russian sorties, aerial bombardment runs that the Russian Air Force conducts routinely over Ukrainian territory. If the Ukrainians can park drones with SAM mounted launchers on their vessels to threaten Russian aviation, that's going to be something very, very beneficial to the Ukrainians, not just on the front lines, but across the country where we've seen so many of these devastating Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure.
Thank you for those clarifications. Thank you, Katerji from Kyiv. And the US has not abandoned its role as a mediator between Ukraine and Russia, the State Department spokeswoman Tammy Bruce has said. That's good news to the world, as the world might have been confused following the State Department earlier comment, widely interpreted as suggesting that Washington had scaled back its involvement in the peace talks. How does one explain this backtracking on behalf of the President of the United States on the previously announced critical shift in geopolitical posturing? Zuzanna Jurek.
The spokesperson for the US Department of State, Tammy Bruce, appears to have backtracked on her earlier statement about the US withdrawing from being the mediator in peace talks between Ukraine and Russia.
There's a lot of fake news about my comments. Here's the truth. As Secretary Rubio has said, if there is no progress in talks between Russia and Ukraine toward a concrete solution, the United States will take a step back as mediator. If and when that happens, will be a decision of the president. We are pushing both parties to deliver real progress.
This latest statement contrasts with what was said on Thursday when she suggested that Washington will abandon mediation between Moscow and Kyiv.
While our style will change, the methodology of how we contribute to this will change in that we will not be the mediators. We are not going to fly around the world at the drop of a hat to mediate meetings, that it is now between the two parties.
The sentiment was mirrored by others within the Trump administration, including the vice president.
When I say this deal, I mean getting these guys to actually propose a peace settlement, but it's going to be up to the Russians and the Ukrainians. Now that each side knows what the other's terms for peace are, it's going to be up to them to come to an agreement and stop this brutal conflict.
The warning signs that the US's commitment to a ceasefire is beginning to quiver came as early as mid-April, following the high-level talks on Ukraine hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris. Speaking after the summit, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio alluded to Washington's growing frustration.
We came here yesterday to sort of begin to talk about more specific outlines of what it might take to end a war, to try to figure out very soon, and I'm talking about a matter of days, not a matter of weeks, whether or not this is the war that can be ended. If it's not possible, if we're so far apart that this is not going to happen, then I think the president's probably at a point where he's going to say, well, we're done.
The US President Donald Trump vowed to achieve a ceasefire within 24 hours of taking office. With a lack of an agreement in sight, the US chief appears to be growing increasingly more frustrated.
If for some reason one of the two parties makes it very difficult, we're just going to say you're foolish, you're fools, you're horrible people, and we're going to just take a pass.
With some observers suggesting that Trump's frustration with prolonged ceasefire negotiations was predictable.
There were already clear signs that American patience will not stay forever, that Americans want a quick deal, they want results very quickly.
This is the standard operating procedure of the Trump administration and of Donald Trump himself. His officials come in and say, oh, we're going to solve everything in 24 hours or 48 hours. And then when they actually face the reality that conflicts are very difficult to resolve, then they stomp their feet.
For TVP World, Zuzanna Jurek.
On Sunday, Romanians will vote in presidential elections. They will cast their votes in an electoral rerun, as the previous attempt to choose a new president was voided by the country's constitutional court. This move plunged Romania into political turmoil. Will the second attempt help the country regain political stability? Our correspondent Paweł Trzaskowski is in Bucharest to find an answer.
On Sunday, Romanians will vote in the country's presidential elections, a rerun of the elections since the last attempt was annulled by the country's constitutional court, citing foreign interference that was supposed to favor an extreme right candidate, Călin Georgescu. Călin Georgescu was eventually barred from running in the presidential runoff, and for handling this situation, the Romanian government came under fire of criticism from the US administration. And this is why US electoral observers are present this time round in Bucharest.
There's a very fine line between, for us back home, it's the First Amendment. It's the ability of the citizen to express themselves. And every citizen in a democracy needs to feel free and comfortable to express themselves in however they feel that they should. But, I understand for managing election situations, it's important also to make sure that appropriate information is getting out. Right. Increased use of social media to disseminate information is obviously a new wave in our elections, and Romania has seen that now. The ultimate goal here is to make sure that Romanians have confidence in the fact that their elections are free and fair.
The candidate lineup is quite different on the second attempt. Out of 11 contenders, 4 are given chances to make it to the second round. Among them, George Simeon, a leader of the right-wing Our Party, Nicuș Ordan, the mayor of Bucharest, Crin Antonescu, a veteran politician backed by the current ruling coalition, and Victor Ponta, a former prime minister. Interestingly, all of them stressed the importance of US-Romanian relations during the presidential campaign.
There is no free world, and there is no future for Europe and the European Union without the United States.
So we have a special partnership with the United States. I want that we keep it and improve it.
From a military point of view, for us, the relationship with America is essential.
Currently, it is George Simeon who is leading the polls, having received support from Călin Georgescu himself and after consolidating the votes of the Romanian right. However, he's being closely followed by Antonescu, Dan and Ponta, and the most likely outcome of tomorrow's ballot is Simeon and one of these 3 candidates making it to the second round. But that's according to the polls, and the polls once proved to be totally unreliable. From Bucharest, Romania, for TVP World, I'm Paweł Trzaskowski.
Serbia's President Alexander Vučić cut short his visit to United States on Friday after allegedly falling ill. This forced him to cancel meetings with US officials. But prior to his visit to Mar-a-Lago, Vučić announced he would take part in the May 9th parade in Moscow. Could the recent development be an indication that the Serbian president's period of geopolitical balancing is reaching its conclusion? Aisha Abache has the story.
From east to west, this seems to be the foreign policy trajectory of Serbian President Alexander Vučić.
Vučić took his shiny new government plane and flew on an unannounced visit to Florida, hoping to get a photo op with Trump, only to declare he fell ill and flew back home empty-handed.
The Serbian leader recently traveled to the United States with a mission to meet US President Donald Trump and strengthen his bonds with the West, but fell short of his goal when he suddenly got ill and had to fly back home, according to Serbian media outlet Blitz.
He went to the US and apparently he was not welcomed, and in order to leave the US with a face, we learned that he got sick. I would argue that in a sense he might be setting up a tone for other leaders in the region, because ahead is very challenging Putin celebration of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War.
While attempting to build ties with the West, Vučić is also reinforcing his eastern alliances, particularly with Russia. In a move that goes against the EU's position, he has confirmed his participation in Moscow's upcoming celebrations on May 9th, joining leaders like Slovakia's Robert Fico.
We see that he tries to position himself as a friend of Putin, as a friend of Trump, as a friend of Ursula von der Leyen, and also to have fantastic relations with the Chinese and the Middle East. But all these efforts are concentrated on his own political survival.
President Vučić has been facing nationwide anti-government protests since November last year, following the collapse of a canopy at a newly renovated train station in Novi Sad. The accident took the lives of 16 people and sparked student-led mass protests demanding government accountability and a thorough investigation into the financing of the renovation, after the station had reopened in July after 3 years of work. As Vučić tries to keep one foot in the east and one in the west, the pressure is mounting as he faces increasing scrutiny both abroad and at home. For TVP World, Aisha Abache.
Saturday marks World Press Freedom Day, and Poland has good reason to celebrate. According to Reporters Without Borders, its press freedom ranking has improved by 16 spots. The development follows a political shift from the right-wing Conservative Law and Justice Party's rule to a centrist coalition led by Donald Tusk, which took control of the government in December 2023. Sonia Gataviszczan has this report.
Saturday marks the World Press Freedom Day, and Poland has good reasons to celebrate. According to Reporters Without Borders, its press freedom ranking has improved by 16 spots. The development follows a political shift from the Law and Justice Party's rule to a centrist coalition led by Donald Tusk, which took control of the government in December 2023.
During the 8 years of the Law and Justice Party rule, the public media were turned into propaganda tools, and privately owned media were subjected to different forms of pressure.
Reporters Without Borders found that verbal attacks and slap suits against private media outlets have declined since the new government took over, and media reform efforts are underway.
I also feel in Poland that at least there have been attempts to depoliticize the media landscape. And we see it's not easy, but it's absolutely necessary.
However, the global press freedom index is at an all-time low.
Journalists ever more, I think, are faced with physical aggression, with online harassment. They are being smeared by politicians. We used to talk about the Trump effect already in 2016, and now, of course, it's getting worse.
Reporters Without Borders recognizes 5 press freedom categories. In 2025, the global average turned from problematic to difficult. Among the determining factors is economic pressure amid a sharp decrease in funding. But for the press, many more threats are looming.
A lot of attacks in the past period especially came in the context of protests. So we have seen, huge protests in Georgia, Serbia, in Turkey, but we also seen some protests in countries like Germany where journalists were attacked.
In active protest setting, over 50% of the attacks on journalists were physical, and approximately 40% of them resulted in bodily harm. In Georgia, that number was even higher, with approximately 73% of assaults leading to injuries. Georgia, Serbia, and Turkey's press freedom ranks suggest low media freedom.
In Turkey, journalists have been arrested at their homes for covering protests. We can clearly see to what extent the current government and President Erdogan do not want to see these demonstrations be covered.
In the worst of cases, journalists paid for reporting with their life. 2024 was lethal for over 100 reporters. Most of them, 55, were Palestinian journalists. But even on European soil, 4 Ukrainian journalists were killed in Russia's war. According to the President of the European Parliament, free press is the best shield for democracy, worthy of being defended not only on the World Press Freedom Day, but every day. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gataviszczan.
On this day, 3rd of May, 234 years ago, the Great Sejm of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth adopted the Government Act, which also is known as the Constitution of May 3rd, 1791. Attempting to introduce progressive democratic reforms way ahead of their time, it was the first in Europe and second in the world of this kind. It was also a bold attempt to preserve the country's sovereignty. Gabriela Fesnek has more.
On this day, 234 years ago, the Great Sejm of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth introduced the Government Act, also known as Constitution of May 3rd, 1791. Attempting to introduce progressive democratic reforms way ahead of its time, it was one of the first documents of this kind in the world. The May 3rd Constitution was adopted at a time when Poland was significantly weakened by destructive wars and in urgent need of reform of state institutions.
The Constitution introduced a lot of reforms and abolished many outdated elements of the state machinery, which had previously been hindering Poland's sovereignty.
The Constitution also intended to end the nobility's monopoly on political power, empowering townsfolk but stopping short of abolishing serfdom. However, Poland's drive to reform alarmed its neighbors who stood to gain from its weakness.
Poland fell when it was reforming itself, trying to become independent independent of foreign influence. During the reign of the previous two monarchs, there were no reforms, and thus no disturbances.
The Government Act was only in effect for 14 months, but its legacy as the first Polish constitution remains, and May the 3rd is celebrated as a national holiday. Although never fully implemented, the constitution remains a point of national pride as a focal point in the history of Polish democracy. For TVP World, Gabriela Fesnak.
100 days of Donald Trump's presidency have passed, but the peace in Ukraine remains still a distant mirage. With no clear signs of Russia coming to the table and mounting their demands, Trump's impatience grows. Roland Frondenstein, co-founder Brussels Hub and an expert of transatlantic relations, joins us now to unpack the dynamic of the ongoing negotiations. Good evening, sir. Thank you for being with us. Or should I say,
thanks for having me.
To unpack the stall in the negotiations, rather. The world is tired with the Kremlin's lies, says Volodymyr Zelenskyy, but without Moscow willing to talk, there's no way the peace talks can advance. So my first question is, what's the Russian strategy? What are its possible objectives apart from repeated maximalist ones?
Well, generally speaking, Russia wants to wear out Ukraine militarily and politically and wear out the West in its resolve to support Ukraine and also wear out the United States. The jury is out whether that attempt with Trump is working or not. I mean, recently there have been some signs that that Trump grew more critical of Putin, but we don't know what the final outcome of the U.S. involvement here will be.
Exactly. Is this strategy working? Well, the U.S. administration has seen some reshuffle recently, while Steve Witkoff remains chief negotiator. Mike Waltz is now gone, and the president loses someone who might have provided him with a different, more hawkish perspective on Russia. So Marco Rubio now, as a national security advisor, is among the chorus of administration officials warning that President Trump might walk away from the negotiations. But on the other hand, as you said, the minerals deal has been signed and Trump lifted the pause on military aid for Ukraine. So what do you make of the situation in the White House? Which facet prevails now?
I think there's only one person in the world that knows what's going to happen, and that is Donald Trump himself. I wouldn't give too much credence to the question of which advisor or which secretary is in which post in the Washington administration. These are people whose main job is to facilitate Donald Trump's job and to defend his policies. So ultimately, really, according to everything I hear from my friends in Washington, it's Donald Trump who decides. And we haven't heard a clear statement of President Trump on how he intends to take this further.
And considering the U.S. has resumed military aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine following the proposed ceasefire, how might that affect the dynamics of the conflict and the likelihood of Russia returning to the table? Do you think it might impress them?
Well, let's be realistic. I mean, so far the reintroduction of intelligence sharing and military assistance is not a long-term commitment. In the minerals deal, it is only said that the United States basically approves of a peaceful Ukraine, and it kind of labels Russia as the aggressor, but there is no clear language, neither in the minerals deal nor in any other statement from Washington, that quantifies and qualifies American assistance to Ukraine with hardware, with intelligence, with other kinds of support. So is the Kremlin strategy working to wear the West out? It's too early to say, honestly. Putin's hope is clearly that the United States walks away in frustration and then at some point stops or supporting Ukraine or significantly decreases its support. And let's remember that this was actually a campaign promise by Trump, is to actually alleviate the burden on the American taxpayer, which means nothing else than stopping to support Ukraine.
So let me now quote Marco Rubio, who warned of the US withdrawing from the Russia-Ukraine negotiations and focusing, quote, on other regions the US should concentrate on. Could he possibly mean Germany? Let's take a listen here.
Germany just gave its spy agency new powers to surveil the opposition. That's not democracy, it's tyranny in disguise. What's truly extremist is not the popular AfD, which took second in the recent election, but rather the establishment's deadly open border immigration policies that the AfD opposes. Germany should reverse course. This is democracy. This decision is the result of a thorough and independent investigation to protect our Constitution and the rule of law. It is independent courts that will have the final say. We've learned from our history that right-wing extremism needs to be stopped.
And quite an accurate answer from the German ambassador. Why do you think is the US administration directly meddling in the internal affairs of German state? What's the purpose of this?
This is domestic warfare. These are US culture wars between the MAGA movement and the liberals in American society, and in fact, not just the liberals, but everybody who believes in the rule of law and American democracy. So they are carrying this conflict, pitting an alleged elite or bureaucratic deep state against the will of the people, which is complete, utter nonsense when you look at countries like Germany or France. Sure enough, national populists have gained in their political weight. They have their voting share has increased, but this is not the majority of the population. And people like J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio and Trump himself should better consider that to most European citizens, this U.S. government is actually unacceptable, and the way it interferes with Elon Musk and X and other platforms, the way they interfere in European politics is completely unacceptable. This is not a question of elite versus the majority in Europe. This is a question of actually Europeans defending their values against radical nationalists in their own midst, and now also against the US government.
Yes, but on the other hand, it could be considered a bombshell what happened. German domestic intelligence agency branded the main opposition party in Germany, the far-right Alternative for Germany Today, as unofficially classified him as a threat to democracy. So with popularity of this movement rising so much, some could claim it's a way of suppressing the influence of the AfD. So what were its violations of core constitutional principles, as the German Office for the Protection of the Constitution put it?
Okay, there are 3 points. It's first of all, the claim that even German citizens that have a migration background should lose their citizenship and should be expelled from Germany. I mean, there are different ways that the AfD has phrased this, but they have basically repeatedly, and all their leaders have made claims like this. So, it's not just a couple of Islamist fundamentalists and criminals, but this is the cultural background of your family, even if you have a German passport, predetermines that you should leave Germany. That is very much against the humanitarian elements of the German constitution. There are two other points. One is an obvious disrespect for the state and its institutions, from parliament to the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the courts, and so on, which the recent report actually labels as despising the state, Germany's democracy. And the third element is very much the rule of law, is the non-acceptance of checks and balances, of independent judiciary and an executive that is responsible and accountable to the parliament, to the judiciary, and to the German public. All these principles have repeatedly been put in doubt, attacked, and assaulted by AfD, and that's why the Office for the Defense of the Constitution, for the Protection of the Constitution, has come to that conclusion now.
Thank you so much, Roland Freudenstein, co-founder of Brussels Freedom Hub. Thank you for being with us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm sure we will have more opportunities to elaborate on this particular subject soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching World News Tonight. I'm Anna Kalczyńska, and see you soon.